We're so oh my goodness, the recording in progress happens. I love that. In case we were not all aware from doing a million of these in the last 2 years. So excited to have all of you here with us, the folks that are in the room with us physically, all of you folks that are on Zoom with us. So on behalf of the Women's Fund, welcome to our latest Doc Talk, very hybrid lunch and learn. We have a really insight-packed event for you today, and I'm really happy that all of us could be here, even if it is virtually. I'm Casey Curry, and I'm a huge fan of the Doc Talks and Women's Fund. I'm what I would call myself a lifelong learner. I'm a meteorologist by trade, so super interested in science and technology, but also as a woman scientist, I've always been very much invested in young women, young girls, knowing that this is a path in life for them, that they can be interested in science and math and technology. And so I love the Women's Fund for giving young girls that inspiration, not just if they want it for their career, but to know that this is knowledge that can make them healthier and happier. So super excited about that. My new role is at Alliant Group, which is where I'm coming to you from today, where health and wellness is such an important part of our practice and helps keep our professionals up and running to make sure we serve our clients the best. So we're really excited to be here with you guys today. Now, as I've been talking a little bit about, the mission of the Women's Fund is to provide Houston area women and girls with the tools that they need to be advocates for their own health. Our health education classes are unique because they present preventative curriculum. These are preventative-based classes that really teach resiliency skills and relate those skills to the current health risks that are out there. So as you're tuning in today, we really invite you to consider the importance of detection for women with breast cancer. All of us with different genetic histories, but it's important for all of us to make sure that we arm ourselves with the knowledge that we need to make sure that we're staying ahead of diagnosis and detection. Bringing awareness to this topic and focusing on breast cancer can potentially open the door to having these conversations with our loved ones and our friends, and of course, our physicians. Across the nation, breast cancer is typically observed during the month of October, but we want to make sure this information is presented even earlier. In fact, I would argue maybe all the time we do this, provide this kind of information. You never know when a woman is going to be getting that diagnosis, when she might be going in for her mammogram, discussions with her physician. And as we're going to learn today, timing is everything when it comes to diagnosis. So we want to make sure we're empowering you to make those right moves and calls for your health. We're going to proceed with the conversation in just a moment. As a reminder, we're always going to have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of our talk today for your questions. So just kind of hold those. Feel free to put them in the chat if you'd like. So we'll make sure that we have those for you. The Women's Fund is going to post a video of today's talk later on this week. So always a great thing to kind of be able to share that with your family members, with your friends. So that'll be a great thing to share. Before we get started, just a few meeting rules. If you're not already muted, please do so. If you have any questions, as we just talked about, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll take them at the end of the discussion. And we're really just going to give our speakers kind of our full attention during this first part of the presentation so that they can focus on the information that they want to impart for us. So we've got some really amazing professionals with us today. Dr. Laura Esserman, Dr. Lisa Medlenski, and Dr. Garcia, I think, is going to try and join us at some point during the talk today. So Dr. Laura Esserman is a professor of surgery and radiology at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF, and director of the UCSF Breast Care Clinic. Her work in breast cancer spans the spectrum from basic science to public policy issues and the impact of both on the delivery of clinical care. Dr. Esserman is recognized as a thought leader in cancer screening and overdiagnosis. She led the creation of the University of California-wide Aetna Breast Health Network, a learning system designed to integrate clinical care and research as it follows 150,000 women from screening through treatment and outcomes. She's also the founder of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute-funded Wisdom Study, which is testing a personalized approach to breast cancer screening in 100,000 women. Dr. Esserman is also a leader of the innovative I-SPY trial model designed to accelerate the identification and approval of effective new agents for women with high-risk breast cancers. Dr. Lisa Medlenski is a board-certified genetic counselor who provides cancer risk assessment and genetic counseling for patients and their families. She helps people investigate their family health history, navigate the genetic testing process, and understand and adapt to the medical or physiological implications of genetic diseases. As director of the Family Cancer Genetics Program at Moores Cancer Center at UC San Diego Health, Dr. Medlenski helps ensure that patients and families with an increased risk of cancer receive outstanding care with a focus on cancer prevention and early detection. In addition to her clinical activities, Dr. Medlenski is a researcher at Moores Cancer Center. Her work centers on cancer prevention in those at increased risk of disease because of their family history or genetic predisposition. Her research themes include clinical genetic testing and follow-up for families with Lynch syndrome and BRCA1 and 2 mutations, the public health implications of cancer genetic testing, quality of life in those at increased risk of cancer, and the integration of cancer risk assessment into family practice and family-level cancer prevention. Dr. Medlenski earned her doctoral degree from the University of Toronto Institute of Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation. She obtained a Master of Science in Genetic Counseling from McGill University in Montreal. So I can't think of a better panel of experts. So we're going to dive into all things breast cancer today, detection, and I promise you, you're going to walk away with so much information as we kind of conclude our discussion in a little bit. So welcome, Laura. Welcome, Lisa. So excited to have you guys here today. I'm going to let you guys kind of dive right into your presentation.
And Casey, okay. Dr. Garcia is also joined, by the way.
Dr. Garcia is here?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
wonderful.
Yes, that is correct.
Oh, welcome, Dr. Garcia. I wasn't sure you were on the line. Great to have you with us. I don't have your bio in front of me. Do you want to give us like a brief intro of yourself? That would be wonderful.
Sure. This is Dr. Carlos Garcia Cantu. I'm the Chief of Quality at DHR HealthNet, and our hospital is at the South Pole of Texas, we call it, close to in Edinburgh, Texas. We created a Center of Cancer as well as a Breast Center of Excellence in the hospital. We take care of every single patient that comes to our hospital, and you can imagine, since we are very close to the border, the patient population is very mixed. We take approximately 250 or plus new cases every year of breast cancer, and we're very interested on detection, prevention, as well as education throughout the valley, the Rio Grande Valley.
Well, Dr. Garcia Cantu, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for jumping right in there. I love it.
Thank you.
All right, so I know that we've got our slides for you guys to kind of go through, and I believe they've started now, so I'll let you guys take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead. And so we're going to talk about the Wisdom Study, which we hope will be a landmark study that transforms our approach to breast cancer screening. But it's always important that if you have a new idea, that you put it to the test, because that's actually how we really make change. And we have to demonstrate that it has the impact that we hope that it will. Next slide. So we've already talked about my introduction. I'm also a singer and songwriter, so those are my hobbies. And you met, next slide, you met Dr. Medlenski, who is also a mom and an avid cross stitcher and the 5-time champ of bumper stumpers. Next slide. And Dr. Garcia, who we just heard from, and really excited to have here as part of our group. Fantastic. Next slide. One of the things we just wanted to start with is a video that was made by Time Magazine about the Wisdom Study, which we thought was really very compelling. So we're just going to play that for you for a moment.
I had never really thought I was high risk for breast cancer. I don't have any family lineage or history of breast cancer, but I tested positive for a genetic mutation which made me higher risk. They recommended I had an MRI, which did show that I had a small mass. It was malignant. That was the process in which I found out I actually had breast cancer. And I would have never gotten an MRI if it hadn't been recommended to me.
I've always had this vision of the right treatment at the right time for the right person. Not every woman has the same risk. Maybe your risk is high enough that you should screen every 6 months or use contrast imaging in between mammograms. And then you don't want to torture the people who don't have that risk, doing a bunch of screening and biopsies and extra things that they don't need. So when you put those things together, does it really make sense to have a one-size-fits-all screening approach?
I really call Black breast cancer a different disease because the mortality numbers are devastating.
We believe that there is going to be this profile that helps us understand who's at risk. Whether you're African American or you're Asian or you're Latina, that profile is probably different.
We need more research, we need more data, we need more women of color in the studies so that we can eradicate breast cancer.
The Wisdom Study is the beginning of a change in screening. And I think people take it very personally. But I'm not criticizing screening, I'm trying to make it better. Elias Zerhouni, the former NIH director, actually said, the greatest risk in medicine is to stop taking risks. And that you have to be willing to let go of the rung to which you are clinging if you want to get to the next rung. Well, we were happy to say that 45,000 women have now joined the study. So that's really very exciting. So let's talk a little bit about why we're doing this study, because it'll tell us a lot about the biology of breast cancer, how our understanding has changed, and why we think it's important to bring screening and prevention along to make those changes. So today, breast screening is done using pretty much the same approach we had when we introduced it in the 80s. Go ahead, next slide. At that time, we really thought breast cancer was one disease. Everyone got treated the same. If you had a cancer that was over a centimeter, you got chemotherapy. Most people got surgery. Everyone got surgery first, and it was mostly a mastectomy. People weren't given choices. And this is about the time I started my practice, and care was fragmented, and women were pretty angry. And they were right to be angry, because we had this model that normal cells move to like atypical cells to this in situ stage, to stage 1, 2, 3, and then we'd get cancer. And we thought, gosh, if we could only just find it sooner, just move that curve where we could find it all early at that earliest stage, carcinoma in situ, or stage 1, we would prevent all those downstream cancers. But that's the importance of when you start something, you have to do the follow-up and look at it. Next slide. Because it turns out that that's just not, that our assumptions weren't correct. And that's okay. That's why you always have to keep learning. You have to always keep asking questions, because it turns out there are different kinds of cancers. Today, we know that breast cancer isn't one disease. Every disease varies. If you think about allergy, for example, you can have an allergic reaction to a bee sting and require epinephrine or die from anaphylactic shock, to someone who just occasionally gets allergic to pollen and needs an over-the-counter antihistamine. They're not the same, right? There's this range of disease. Well, it turns out in cancer, that's true too. Everything goes from, the lowest risk where there's potential harm, if a cancer, you find it and it's just going to stay smoldering along and never go on to kill somebody, finding it, if you can't recognize it, leads to overtreatment and potential harm. The cancers where you really make the biggest difference in screening are where it says tumor C, right? Because you've got time on the bottom, and over on that y-axis, you have the advancing stages of cancer, right? So finding tumor C early makes a huge difference. That's going to be where we save lives. But for these really fast, aggressive cancers, these are the cancers that we used to blame women for. Oh my God, you waited and you didn't come in. It's your fault. That's not true. They just have bad biology. And when tumors grow that fast, there's like a couple of really important things to know about this. One is that those fast growing tumors, it's hard to imagine that a screen where those black lines are every year is going to do the trick. And in fact, in our I-SPY trial, we see that most of the cancers that are bad aren't screen detected because they're either in women who are too young for screening, or they show up between screens, or women just weren't screening. And so there you need to do something different. You have to know who's at risk for those cancers. You have to be able to think about whether you can prevent them or start them on an every 6 month screening, or figure out how to prevent them. And it's an important lesson for young women in particular. Now, breast cancer is not that common when you're young, but you can get breast cancer in your 20s and 30s, and they're usually aggressive cancers. So if you feel a mass, you need to go in and get it checked out if something's new and different. Or when you're older, if you get a mass between screens, you got to go in too. Just because you had a normal mammogram shouldn't say, oh, I'm fine, I had a normal mammogram. So these are important public health lessons that we need to teach people, because these are things that we've learned. And so our message is that screening should reflect that new understanding of breast cancer biology. Next slide. So we also know that the subtypes, these are just some of the ways in which we classify breast cancers. People have heard the word triple negative. That means it doesn't have markers on the surface for estrogen or progesterone or a marker called HER2. And those cancers are not only more common in younger women, but they are more common in African-American women. And that's important to know. So that we know that people also likely have different predisposition. Next slide. So these are the things that we're trying to learn and incorporate. And so the subtypes should tell us how much risk you have if you get a cancer, the timing of that risk. Some cancers come back very quickly. Some cancers come back very late. And that actually depends on the biology. Low-grade hormone-positive cancers don't have much risk early, but they can recur late. These are things that we have to know. So they tell us about the timing of the risk of recurrence if you have it, which therapies will be the best, better ways to approach prevention or dropping recurrence. If we know that you're at risk for a slow-growing hormone receptor-positive cancer, we know the kinds of things that we can do to reduce that risk, including some medicines that really drop the risk. Next slide. So breast cancer really impacts different communities differently. Last year, over 42,000 women died in the United States alone. Worldwide, it's huge impact. Turns out that white and Black women have higher rates of breast cancer, but importantly, if you're African American, your risk of dying of breast cancer is higher than your white sisters. That's actually really important. It's the highest cause of cancer death in African American women. And for Hispanic women, it happens to be the most common cancer that they would get, and still the leading cause of death in that community. And that's despite the way we screen today, and despite the fact that we probably are getting the same rates of screening. So this isn't to say that screening is no good. It's to say we need to do better. We need to build on what we've learned and make it better. Next slide. So these are the statistics in Texas, right? So this is the mortality rate. And again, you can see these same problems here, that Hispanic women and African-American women are dying at higher rates. This is not good. We don't want to accept that. Next slide. And screening in Texas, there are, again, pretty high rates of screening. So we don't want to keep doing the same thing, because those disparities in death rates are not acceptable. And some of that has to do with the type of cancer people get. So we've got to do a better job of figuring out who's really at risk for what kind of cancer and intervene when it makes a difference. Right time, right place. Next slide. These are the breast cancer statistics for DHR. You can see that they've done a great job of screening. They're screening about 40,000 women. And we probably have not all of the cancers that have been abstracted from 2021 because 2021 is just barely finished. But this is just in your system, right, Dr. Cantu? This is just, over 300 cancer cases every year, right?
That is correct. And we were affected, as you can see, also by COVID during those years, or that year, 20 and 21. The screening actually decreased, and it became a problem because we started to see now the problems of not having also the only screening tool that is the most common, which is the mammogram, in all those patients that couldn't come for their screening. So now we can see that patients are coming more to the office. They are looking for more ways of screening. And also we're seeing patients that are coming with more advanced breast cancer.
Yeah. And I think one of the really heartbreaking things about the pandemic is that people who actually had a mass did not go in or weren't able to get in when they had a mass. And those are the people where they really got in trouble and had much more advanced disease. So again, the message that we were trying to give is it doesn't matter if there's a pandemic. If you feel a mass, pandemic or not, that is something you need to go in for. And it's a good reminder to us that, again, those things that show up between screens are the ones that can give you the most trouble, and you can't ignore it. Next slide. There have just been years of disagreement about how to screen. We have been arguing in the last decade over data that is actually 3 decades old. The data on screening was generated, from the 80s and 90s. Again, when we didn't even know that there was an estrogen receptor, and we didn't actually know that breast cancer was more than one disease. And that's the data we keep arguing about. So the US Preventive Task Force guidelines says that women should start screening every other year if they're 50, and maybe if they're high risk in their 40s, have shared decision-making. American Cancer Society says it's annual when you're 45 to 55, and then every other year once you're 55. American College of Radiology and the Society of Breast Imaging says every woman starting at 40, until her life expectancy is less than 5 years, should be screening every year, and so on and so forth. What's a woman to do? How do we interpret that? I say time to generate new data. New slide. Because this is doing the same thing over and over again isn't going to improve things. Because as I said, there's still 40,000 women dying in the US alone, despite our screening. And half of our stage 2 and 3 breast cancers present as these new masses. So we've got to do better. I think another thing is that when women are called back, it's scary. But when they are called back to get, and if you screen every year for 10 years, you have a 50% chance of a callback. And if you're asked to get a biopsy, that is truly frightening to women. And most women think, oh my God, I'm dead. I've got cancer, I'm going to die, until they get that answer back. But 3/4 of those biopsies turn out to be false alarms. So that's scary. So I think we want to make sure that we do a better job of right sizing who we're screening. If you're screening people more at high risk, we're going to do better at bringing the right people in. And to remember that 50% of cancers are found by women themselves. As I've said before, don't ignore a mass when you find it. So we can apply what we've learned about breast cancer to screening. And remember that doing more for the person who has less risk does not save the life of the person who has higher risk. Next slide. And you're going to learn more about the kinds of genetic information we're talking about, but every woman also has a different risk of developing breast cancer. Women have different family history. They inherit different genes. Some women have dense breasts. Some people's tissue is fatty. That determines your risk. People are different ages. They have different races and ethnicities. Whether they've had other breast disease, what time they started their periods, whether they had kids and when they had kids. every woman is not the same. Every woman doesn't wear a pair of size 8 jeans, you know? So it just strikes us is that it doesn't make sense in 2022 to be screening everybody the same. Next slide. So we're going to actually tell you a little bit more about family history and genetics. Next slide. Because we want to put out, this is the hypothesis we have. This is what we think. If our bodies are different, the biology is different, if our risk is different, you know, we can do something different, right? So how can we improve breast cancer screening and detection for all women? By starting a modern era trial. And Wisdom is that. It's a large scale randomized study, a platform trial to test these new approaches that could make breast screening more personalized and save lives. It's so important that we include women of every race and ethnicity, because if they participate, then their information will be represented and the results will apply to them. Participation means representation. And today we know how important that is. We want better breast health education and preventive options. You don't need to do prevention if your risk is really low, but if your risk is high, there are things today that we can do to lower that risk. And there should be things tomorrow that we can do that are better. Clinical studies, a lot of people say, oh gosh, I don't want to participate in a study. But studies are tomorrow's treatments today. That's how we make things better. We want tomorrow to be better today than today. And the only way we do that is to keep studying it, keeping making improvements, and trying to make it better for everyone. Next slide. So this study, Wisdom, is women informed to screen depending on measures of risk. And we're comparing that standard approach, starting at 40, a mammogram every year, to a more personalized approach based on genetics, family history, breast density, race, ethnicity, prior biopsies, etc. It's open to any woman between the ages of 40 and 74 who has never had a diagnosis of breast cancer or DCIS. You have to live in the United States. And anyone is eligible, regardless of your insurance status. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this over to Lisa, to Dr. Medlenski, to help us understand, help all of you understand the role that genetics plays in our breast cancer risk, as well as in the Wisdom study. Next slide.
Great, thank you. So I'll thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I also will point out, I am not only a researcher on the Wisdom study team, I'm also a participant. I was randomized and I'm in the annual arm. So I continue just getting annual mammograms, and that data goes and feeds into the study. And at the end, my little data points will contribute. So I'm proud to be on both sides of this wonderful study. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what genetic testing goes on in the Wisdom study, because it is one of the top questions that potential participants ask. And because genetic testing has evolved quite quickly over the last decade, there have been a lot of changes and a lot of, really big discoveries in the world of genetics and our understanding of cancer risk. So I'm going to walk you through sort of the cutting edge genetic testing that is part of the Wisdom study. And to understand this, you kind of have to know that the building blocks of our cells and our bodies, it's DNA. It's like a little tiny instruction manual that is packed inside of every single one of the trillions and trillions of cells in your body. And you get half of that genetic code from your mom, you get half of it from your dad. Next slide, please. And I kind of like to think about our genes like little instruction manuals. We have about 20,000 different genes in our genetic code, in our DNA. You're probably familiar with things like your blood type. That's a trait that is inherited. And one of your genes is like a little instruction manual that says you are going to have blood type A. And it's like a little blueprint that tells your body how to make that protein on your blood cells that makes you type A blood type. All of the aspects of our physical development, how we grow, how our cells grow and divide, how damage gets repaired in our cells. Do we like the taste of cilantro or not so much? All of these different traits in our body are in our DNA. And from a cancer risk point of view, there are many, many genes that are repair genes. Their job in the cell is to go along and repair any damage that happens to the DNA itself. It's almost like little instruction manuals that can go in and repair typos on their own. And there's a lot of different terminology that gets used and can be kind of tricky. So anytime there's variation in our DNA, we call that a variant. It's like, I'm Canadian, so we spell the letter gray, or the word gray, I can never even remember if it's G-R-A-Y or G-R-E-Y. Doesn't matter, right? Everyone recognizes that that is the word gray, and nobody's really going to fight about it. Our DNA is full of these tiny little genetic changes that are of no consequence, right? We are not clones of each other. We are, humanity is very, very diverse in every single way. And it's because we have a lot of variation, millions of areas in our genetic code that make us different from any other person walking down the street. When there's variation in our genetic code that actually makes a gene not work properly, it kind of breaks that instruction, and now that instruction can't be carried out in our cells, we can call that a mutation or a pathogenic variant. There's a lot of different terms for it. But at the end of the day, it's understanding these kind of minor genetic changes, these variants, as well as these mutations that help us understand what our potential risk for cancer might be, because we want to know how well is our repair system working. Next slide, please. When we think about breast cancer, most breast cancer is what we call sporadic, meaning these are women that we think are average risk, or so we might think. There's no obvious family history, just like the woman in the video. There's no positive genetic test that they've had. Breast cancer develops, and often women just kind of wonder, why did this happen? On the other end is hereditary cancer, and these are typically families that have a really strong family history, multiple generations of women getting diagnosed with breast cancer and potentially other cancers as well. And these are the families, you look at the family tree and you think, my goodness, there must be something genetic going on here. And then in between is familial cancer, where maybe there are two close relatives in a family who have had breast cancer, but not the really extreme pattern that we see in the high-risk hereditary cancer families. Next slide, please. And when we think about the genes that are involved in this, within the Wisdom study, we have come up with a panel test of 9 different breast cancer genes that are included. And these aren't unique to the Wisdom study. If you are meeting with your doctor or a genetic counselor, or somebody in your family is interested in genetic testing to understand breast cancer risk, these are really the core genes that are going to be part of that test. Most people have heard of the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, or BRCA1 and BRCA2. These are the ones that often end up in the news with Angelina Jolie or Beyonce's dad, people who have publicly talked about testing positive and what that has meant for their health. Those are the 2 genes that give the highest level of risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer and some other cancers, but there are others. There are also some genes now that we know are kind of like milder versions of the BRCA genes. And then we have a really unique and innovative way to look at risk factors that are all those little variants we talked about that, superficially may not be very important, but when you add them together, they can be. Next slide, please. So with the BRCA genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, about 1 in 500 women will test positive for one of these mutations. In general, they're not terribly common. Unless you happen to have Ashkenazi or European Jewish ancestry, and then about 1 in 40 women end up carrying one of these mutations. They're much more common in that population. And what we usually see in families that have these mutations is young onset breast cancer diagnosed before menopause. We often see a family history of ovarian cancer, not uterine, not cervical, but ovarian cancer specifically. And in men who carry BRCA2 mutations specifically, we see an increased risk of male breast cancer, more aggressive prostate cancer, not the usual kind of slow growing, that kind that's diagnosed in older men, but a younger, more aggressive prostate cancer. And we see a slight increase in the risk of pancreatic cancer as well. And there are options. We've been studying these genes for decades now, about 20 years, and we have good evidence as to what can reduce the risk of cancer in families that have these particular genes. So, for example, screening, instead of just mammograms, we want to make sure women with these mutations are getting MRIs. That's really the mainstay for women who test positive. And the age of their screening is going to be bumped much, much younger because most of the breast cancers happen at a much younger age in these families. Some women do choose to have mastectomies to reduce their risk. Other women will take a medication to reduce their risk. And removing the ovaries once a woman has completed her childbearing and is in her late 30s to early 40s, depending on a lot of other factors, is the way to reduce and eliminate the risk of ovarian cancer. Next slide, please. But there are more genes than just the BRCA genes. And the ones that we test for in Wisdom and the ones that most modern genetic tests include in addition to the BRCA genes are listed here. So the first four, TP53, P10, STK11, and CDH1, these all cause very rare genetic syndromes. You don't pick these up very often unless you are someone who knows you have one of these syndromes in your family and you have an extraordinarily strong family history. So these are very, very rare. But for the rare people who have them, it's very important and it impacts their risk a great deal. So that's why we include them. The three that are listed below that, ATM, PALB2 or PALB2, and CHEK2, this is really where we're identifying a lot of women who are testing positive for these. About 1% of women will test positive for a mutation in one of these three genes. So they're much more common. The risk, however, is not anywhere near as high as it is for the BRCA genes. We consider them to be more moderate risk. And this is where we really aim to do a very personalized risk assessment. So it's not just that you tested positive. It's, do you have family history? What's your current age? What are your other risk factors and protective factors? And we put all that together to come up with a really personalized screening recommendation for the women who test positive for these. So this is really where the Wisdom study is making a difference for women who are participating in the arm that gets a personalized risk assessment, because often these are women who have no family history, have no indication that they had an increased level of risk. Next slide. And this is another really innovative thing that is going on in the Wisdom study. It's a new way of looking at genetic risk that is very different from the genetic testing in the traditional way that I just described. This is called a polygenic risk score. And what this means is we kind of look at all of these little variants that are scattered across the genome, and individually, they don't really change your risk by very much, maybe a tiny, tiny amount. But if you add them together, you can actually find people who, you know, by the luck of the draw, I call it Mother Nature's poker hand. If we were to take 1 million women and everybody got dealt a hand of cards, most people are going to get some good cards and some not so good cards. But there are going to be people who get dealt a really great hand and people who get dealt a really lousy hand. Next slide, please. And this little diagram down in the bottom right kind of shows that for most people, their polygenic risk score, or the, you know, how many of these bad cards were they dealt, is going to be in the middle, right? For most human traits, this is what it looks like. Most people are kind of, you know, didn't get a great hand, didn't get a lousy hand, but got a mixture. It's those people on the very far end who happen to get dealt a lot of these risk variants, and they add together And that actually puts them at a level of breast cancer risk that's not that different from some of those other single genes that we test for. So again, for women who are in that very end of the curve, who have a high polygenic risk score, we do a very personalized assessment that takes all of those other factors into account. And this also helps us identify women at the other end of the curve who, if we go looking for BRCA mutations in other genes, breast density, family history, exposures, risk factors, protective factors, and polygenic risk score, it's kind of like we're looking everywhere we possibly can. And there are some women who really, truly have a very low risk of developing breast cancer when we look at all of these different components. Next slide. So in the Wisdom study, this is part of the personalized arm. So in the Wisdom study, you can choose to be randomized, and you're either in the annual mammogram arm where you just keep going for annual mammograms, or you're in the personalized arm. And as part of the personalized arm, that's where the genetic testing happens. For women who learn that they have tested positive for one of these mutations, they are connected with a genetic counselor. This is all at no cost. This is done as part of the study. And this is really to make sure that women who test positive for these mutations are plugged into their local health system so that they get the appropriate follow-up that is needed for women who do test positive. Next slide. And that's the end of my genetics section. I will just wrap up by reiterating the importance of having a diversity of participation in Wisdom. One of the challenges with the polygenic risk scores, obviously part of the reason we all have differences in our genetic background is because our ancestors came from different parts of the world and developed, different variation in our genes to adapt to whatever environment we happened to be exposed to. And so, unfortunately, most of the polygenic risk scores that have developed, and some were being sold by some commercial genetic test companies, actually had a little disclaimer at the bottom saying this is only for women of European ancestry, which is obviously really unacceptable. In Wisdom, we are developing risk scores for women of all ancestries, and importantly, recognizing that most people are actually admixed to a certain extent. When you really dig into our genetic makeup and look at ancestry, most of us have some genetic background from all over the world. And so understanding what that genetic background means for breast cancer risk is really important. So that's one of the reasons we want to develop these better tools so that our risk assessments can be more accurate for women regardless of their ancestry. So I believe I will end there and hand it back to Dr. Esserman.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think it's important just to know, and then we're going to open up to questions. So be thinking of what questions you might have, and we'll have a discussion. So what does participation look like? And I think it's important to say we've made it easy for people to participate. You just go to wisdomstudy.org and can sign up, doesn't matter where you got your care. But when we ask for people to participate, it's like joining a movement. When you participate and you fully join, you are changing the future for yourselves, for your daughters, your friends, your mothers. And so if you are too young to join, your mom or your mom's friends can join. If you are old enough to join, then you can join. And your friends can join, and your sisters can join. But it's really important to know that, you sign up on your smartphone or computer. There's no cost to participate. You don't need to have insurance. We just follow you for several years. But if you don't stay engaged with us and we can't follow you, the study's no good. So we want people to come, with a mindset, wow, we want to be part of this. We want to be part of helping to change what our future looks like. So we first get you enrolled, you sign up. Now we give people a choice. If you feel strongly about one of these, about being either getting screened every year or being in the personalized arm, you can actually choose to be in the observation group and choose which arm you want to be in. If you're not sure, then let the study choose for you, and that helps us learn in ways that are very important. Once we collect we have to collect your prior mammogram, and actually we ask you or show you if you can get a copy of that for us. It makes it so much easier than if we have to go get it ourselves. That's really the one piece that that we need. And Lisa Medlenski, by the way, said that she just did her annual screening survey, which is great. If you're in the wisdom, in the personalized arm, we simply send you a home saliva spit kit. You get a little box in the mailbox, you open it up, spit in the tube, put it back in, ship it, gets picked up by the mailman, mailwoman, whatever. Your results come back in a few weeks and voila, you get a new assignment. Now we ask you to follow the advice. Sometimes that's tricky. You think, oh, this is interesting, but we really do want you to follow the advice. That's the whole point. We want to see if you follow the advice, does that make a difference? That's how we test it. And then you just fill out an annual survey and that's it. And if anything happens, you just let us know. So it's actually not really much work, but it's really important to be engaged. Next slide. As I said before, any woman between 40 and 74 has never had breast cancer, lives anywhere in the United States. We want every race, a woman of every race, every ethnicity to participate. We invite them. Again, we want all new guidelines to be relevant and applicable to everyone in the country. So it's important to have that representation of the trial. Next slide. And we've had about 45,000 women who have joined across the country. You can see where it is. See that blank spot where Texas is? We want to do it. We want that to be a big, bright purple circle next year. So, about over 10,000, almost 20,000 women actually have learned their genetic risk for breast cancer, and about 1,000 have learned that they're at elevated risk and gotten counseling from us. I think we're up to about 400 cancers now. Next slide. And so we hope that everybody will join. And we wanted to take a little time now for any questions that you might have.
Awesome. So I encourage all of you to put your questions in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of folks mentioning that they've already taken part in the study, which is really cool. And my question immediately was, you're still looking for people to participate.
We want another 15,000 women to join this year.
And I saw you didn't have a big purple bullseye on top of Texas, which we'd like to change.
We would, and we can do it. We can do it this year.
How do you find is the best outreach? Because I would imagine, of course, we've got people on this call, but then what's the best way to reach out to folks and say, hey, we'd like you to participate in this study? Do we just send them a link and say, hey, check this out? Maybe we send them
yes, you can just send them a link and say how this is so important. This is a study that you can participate in that will change the way we do breast cancer screening and prevention in the future. If you're between 40 and 74, you've got to join this study. This is so important. It just sent out a message of that. I think the more people talk about it, the more they do it. We need to educate the physicians. Dr. Garcia-Cantu, I think that you guys really have an ambition to have all of DHR community join and be a point person in Texas, a point site in Texas. What are you thinking?
Yes, and I have to say that it's exciting actually to see another way of assessing the risk on patients for breast cancer. Is something that we have done as far as the genetic testing is concerned for a while already. On every single patient that has breast cancer, we assess for genetics. As you know, it's very important for the surgical treatment too. In a patient that will eventually need to undergo an appropriate treatment, that treatment has to be tailored, and the genetic testing is essential for deciding on breast preservation versus non-preservation of the non-preservation surgical treatment. So it's extremely important to be focused on the genetic testing as far as the surgical treatment is concerned. As you know, DHR in South Texas is going to be also the recruiting center for the whole state of Texas. So we're excited in having the participation on the Wisdom trial, and we expect also to make a big change on the screening of patients for breast cancer.
I think letting physicians know in your networks are really important too, but I think, again, this is an ask directly to women.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of questions in the chat specifically related to the study. And Teresa wanted to know, why do you cut off the age at 40? Because we've talked about how there are some outliers with younger women developing breast cancer. Why do you cut the study at 40?
Fantastic question. Okay. So breast cancer in the 30s is just not very common. It would be prohibitively expensive to screen women in their 30s. But if we knew who was at risk, then we could take that 2 to 3% of people who needed screening. And in fact, that's when we get to Wisdom 2.0, we're going to open it up to women in their 30s who fit that risk profile. Part of what we've tried to do with the Wisdom study is try and figure out, okay, of the people at risk, of the people who have mutations, it turns out, what is it, Lisa, 75, 80% actually don't have a first degree family relative.
Yeah, similar to that. And I think one point to add on to that is that if there are women under the age of 40 who do have a strong family history or a moderate family history, you know, just because you're not eligible to join the Wisdom study, you can still talk to your doctor about, you know, whether genetic testing makes good sense for you. There was also a question in the chat about how to access a polygenic risk score if you're not part of the study because you're under 40. A cautionary tale, one of the things that we're testing in Wisdom is, does the polygenic risk score actually make a difference in making these recommendations? There have been some commercial laboratories that offered polygenic risk score and then actually retracted them because of the, you know, kind of lack of fairness and lack of equity in who these polygenic risk scores were being made available to. One lab still offers them. They kind of oddly all of a sudden said, oh, no, it's fine now. It's good for everybody, even though we said it wasn't before, which seems a little bit sketchy, to be completely honest. So there are currently no, what I will say is clinically validated polygenic risk scores. This is one of the things the Wisdom study is testing to see if it makes a big difference and should be something that is offered moving forward. This is, you know, like Dr. Esserman said at the beginning, these are the questions we have, and we want to get good answers before it's something that's just offered to everybody in the population. It might turn out to not be helpful. And in that case, we can say, we have evidence that this particular component of our risk assessment isn't helpful. So let's not spend money on that. Let's spend money on the stuff that really does make a difference.
If you want to do better, you got to know better. And the only way to know better is to do a study and to ask the question and be willing to be wrong, right? So we think it's better, but we're willing to test it. And if it is, then everyone will benefit. And as I said, we hope next year to be able to change the study so that we can increase it. You know, again, this genetic test needs to be done once. There's no reason you can't do it at age 30 as opposed to age 40. And then the vast majority of people wouldn't need to start screening till they're 50. Some might not even need to screen every other year. Maybe their risk is so low they could screen every 3 years. We're actually looking at modeling some of this because that would be good. And that easily allows us to afford that intensive screening for the 2 or 3% of people who need that screening in their 30s. A lot of people don't know, but screening, and on the whole, in 2014, we estimated it was somewhere in the range of $8 to $10 billion. Today, it's somewhere upwards of 20 to 25 billion. So for that amount of money, can we afford to do a better job of screening those at-risk people? 100%. But we also have to be mindful of, let's not overtreat the people at lowest risk. There's plenty of money in the system to do the right thing. We just have to figure it out. That's what a study is about. It's about trying to figure out how to make tomorrow's approaches better than today. And when we do it in the context of a study, we can make change that for the better for everyone.
So Deborah asked, she says she's got a friend who is over 40, whose mom had ovarian cancer. Would her friend be a good candidate for the Wisdom study?
Every woman is a good candidate for the Wisdom study if they haven't had cancer. But it may be that, again, she might want to be part of the personalized arm, for example, and learn more about her risk, in which case she would choose the observational arm and learn about that, which is fine. We understand that there are people who will feel strongly. Some people would say, I'm never going to do screening less than every year. Great, join the every year arm. That's how we'll sort it out.
Got it. You mentioned one of the things I noted, you just mentioned it again a few minutes ago, and also during the discussion, we were talking about, folks who you discover are high risk, whether it's the genetic predisposition, the family history part, whether it's an ethnicity that makes you more high risk, and kind of funneling our efforts into those folks that we know are super high risk, but yet we know that we've got outliers in that. How do we balance that, like from a human perspective? Because I know like genetic, like from a statistics perspective, it makes sense to funnel our resources into folks that are high risk. But to the person who's not high risk but develops cancer, those statistics don't mean a whole lot. So Lisa, I see you nodding, like you kind of get where I'm going here.
Of course.
How do you kind of balance that?
Well, I think, of course, it's true that no test is perfect, but what we're looking for, what we can look at is when we don't know enough to be able to say, don't screen or do screen more, then we'll do what we think is the best data. I mean, the best data actually showed that screening every other year, starting at 50, that's sort of a worldwide. The data generated from Sweden is sort of what started all the screening, and that's what they do. That's what the Netherlands does. That's what France does. That's the UK does it every 3 years, starting at 50. So, there's a lot of variation. So we're not going to stop screening unless we have the outliers. Someone at super low risk, they're just going to get the side effects of screening, but we're not going to stop following them. We will follow them. That's the importance of having people join a study. If we just put out the recommendations, tell everybody to do it, we have no idea is that better? We're no better off than we are today. But if we all join together, we all say, well, I'll follow these guidelines and I'm going to participate, we'll all learn and we can keep making it better. The trick is to generate the evidence and constantly improve. That's my vision for how we solve this problem. I just want to say one thing is, when I started practice, the biggest killer for women was heart disease. But today, the biggest killer is cancer. Not because cancer's increased so much, but because they've cut the risk of dying of heart disease in half. And how did they do it? In 1945, they started a study called the Framingham Study to figure out
I think Laura froze up on us.
She did. Framingham Study did basically what Wisdom is doing. It assessed risk factors, followed people for many, many years, and was able to identify, these are the things that give you a high risk of heart disease, and what can we do about it? Yeah. So that's the idea here, is using data from decades ago in terms of breast cancer risk, and using old film mammogram machines, right? Instead of the digital ones we have now. Laura's back. But
sorry, I must have cut out, right?
That's okay. But yeah, the idea of using modern data to understand things.
Right. So they figured out who is at risk, how to screen for it, what those intermediate measures were, then how to lower the risk, blood pressure, cholesterol, diet, exercise, and they brought the risk down in half. My gosh. We've got to be able to do that in breast cancer. We don't have to just keep accepting that we have to stay where we are. If we don't change, we don't upgrade, then we're not going to change, and that's just unacceptable. But we can do it.
Well, and I want to be respectful of your time today, our folks that are joining us online, but I cannot let us get out of here without asking about Dr. Medlenski's bio, where you said you're a bumper stumper. What is this? Am I the only person who doesn't know this? Can we explain that for me before we let everybody go today?
Yeah, it's one of these like fun facts that people ask you to put on your bio.
Is it Canadian?
Back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a game show. You can still see it on the Game Show Network, apparently, called Bumper Stumpers, and you had to guess what the bumper said, the license plate said. And one of my college roommates and I went on just as a joke, and we ended up being 5-time champions, and it paid for one of my years of college. So that's my fun fact.
I love it. I feel so much better now. I wrote it down and I was like, I'm going to wait and see if I can just get the answer before we let everybody go today. Thanks you guys so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks so much for having us. And we hope we've educated the community and gotten everyone really excited about joining the movement and making the future better.
Yes, so thank you, Dr. Medlenski and Dr. Esserman, for this informative discussion. We appreciate your expertise on the topic, and now we're going to be leaving this presentation with wonderful information around the wisdom study and breast cancer detection. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day. We understand you're so very busy, and we are very grateful that you took the time to give this information to our community. My name is Kayla Rogers. I'm the program supervisor for the Women's Fund, and we are so thrilled that you were able to join us this Thursday afternoon for another great discussion. I want to take this opportunity to thank Casey Curry for taking part in today's conversation and give a huge shout out to the Alliant Group for hosting us today. In addition, we could not have done this without our Doc Talk series sponsor, the John P. McGovern Foundation and the Wendy Haskell Meyer Endowment. Their support for close to 35 years has been instrumental in the Women's Fund's success, and their help has provided funding for today's program. I want to thank you for attending our first Doc Talk of the year. We are hoping to have another Doc Talk next month, so be on the lookout for that date. We will be covering a new platform in accessing mental health. So it's going to be a wonderful discussion, and we hope that you'll be able to join us. If you have an interest in a particular topic for Doc Talk, we encourage that you reach out to us through our website, thewomensfund.org, or you can give us a call at 713-623-6543. If you enjoyed today's program, please like us on Facebook or follow our other social media platforms on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We are under the Women's Fund Houston. We post regularly about upcoming events that we have, but you can always visit our website, thewomensfund.org, to find out what events are currently scheduled and register there as well. That concludes today's Doc Talk. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again so much for joining us, and stay safe and healthy. Bye.